Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We're glad you're with us for another deep dive, where we try to get right to the heart of some really critical theological questions.
Today we're tackling something.
Mm.
Well, something pretty weighty. It's this whole question of discerning a genuine divine call to the Christian ministry.
And we need to be clear right from the start. We're not talking about the general call for all Christians to share their faith. We're zeroing in on the specific, specialized office of the pastor or the bishop, the man set apart to actually oversee the flock.
Right. And to help us get some real clarity, we're going to be leaning on a couple of figures who took this with, the utmost seriousness. We're talking about Charles Spurgeon and John Newton.
They really didn't see this as, just another career path. For them, it was a solemn quest and trial. And that's our mission today, to really understand what makes a call legitimate and, just as important, what disqualifies a man.
And the stakes are incredibly high. Spurgeon pulls no punches. He says a mistaken call can be a fearful calamity for the man himself.
And a grievous affliction for the church he's supposed to be leading. It's seen as something as vital, as absolutely essential to the pastor, as conversion is to any Christian.
So yeah, no pressure.
None at all. Let's start with the foundation, then. This idea that it has to be a divine appointment, not something you just choose for yourself.
Okay, so this is the absolute first principle we have to get straight. There's a critical distinction between what all Christians are called to do and what this one office requires.
Which is what, exactly?
Every Christian, man or woman, has a duty to spread the gospel. That's just part of being a believer. According to your gifts and your situation, that's a given.
But that's not the pastorate. I might be really enthusiastic, I might be good at talking to people, but that doesn't automatically mean I'm called to be a pastor.
Exactly. Because the pastoral office is so much more than just evangelism. It demands a man's entire life. It's a total dedication to spiritual work, which, and this is key, means a deliberate separation from other secular callings.
So the idea of being a pastor as a sort of side gig, that's out.
It's completely out. Spurgeon was very direct about this. He didn't think a man called to the ministry should be trying to run a large business on the side or have his mind consumed by secular ventures. The work is too demanding.
It compromises the whole idea of the commission, doesn't it?
It does. And you have to remember, the office isn't just about teaching. It's about teaching and ruling. Oversight. That's the other half of the job. Peter says, feed the flock, taking the oversight thereof.
That combination of teaching and governance really sets the pastor apart.
It does. And it leads straight to the next point, which is non-negotiable. The mandate, the call, has to come from above. You cannot appoint yourself.
It's the Holy Ghost who appoints overseers.
Yes. The gifts needed for that kind of work, for ruling and teaching, they're not promised to every believer. So Spurgeon uses this really strong language. He says, no man may intrude into the sheepfold.
Intrusion? That's a very charged word. It sounds hostile, like breaking and entering.
It's meant to. It's meant to completely remove the idea that the pastorate is just some human organization looking for volunteers. If you rush in without being sent, you run the risk of God's own judgment from Jeremiah 23.
Passage about the false shepherds.
Yes, where God says, I sent them not, neither commanded them, therefore they shall not profit this people at all.
That is a terrifying thought, that the effectiveness of your entire ministry is tied to whether you were actually sent in the first place. You could work yourself to the bone for years, but if you weren't sent,
it will be barren. It will not profit the people, which means the burden of proof is always on the man who claims the call. If there's no fruit, if people's lives aren't being changed, then you have to seriously question the commission itself.
And you can see this logic built right into the titles the New Testament uses for pastors. They all imply that someone else did the sending.
Take ambassadors for God. Paul uses that in 2 Corinthians 5. What's an ambassador? He doesn't just decide to represent his country.
No, he's sent. His authority comes entirely from the king or the government that commissioned him.
Right. A self-appointed ambassador, as Spurgeon says, would be a laughingstock. And if that's true in a worldly court, how much more so when you claim to be representing the King of Kings? The authority has to originate with God.
It's the same logic with the title Stewards of the Mysteries of God, isn't it?
It's the exact same logic. A steward manages property that isn't his. He is appointed to that office by the master. He doesn't just show up and decide he'd be good at running the household.
If he does that, he's an interloper, a thief.
Exactly. And then you have Ephesians 4, where pastors are described as actual gifts from the ascended Christ to the church. They're given by God, not self-elevated. So a man has to be able to say, like Paul, that his ministry is not of man, neither by man.
The commission is everything. And this isn't some new idea in the New Testament. It has deep roots in the Old Testament prophets.
They are the clearest examples of what a divine commission actually looks like. Their authority never came from some internal feeling of confidence. It was always a direct divine initiation.
You think of Isaiah. He only says, "Here am I, send me." After his lips are touched with the coal, after he hears the voice of the Lord asking who will go.
It was a whole event. It wasn't just a strong feeling. And Jeremiah's call was maybe the ultimate example of this. The Lord tells him, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations."
Preordination, that just takes all human choice out of the equation.
It completely does. It shows that God sets people over nations and kingdoms for these massive, weighty tasks. It's not something you just decide to do one Tuesday afternoon. Ezekiel has to eat the scroll. He has to internalize God's word before he's sent. It's always God's initiative.
Okay, so the external commission from God is the foundation. But how does a man begin to even suspect he has that commission? That brings us to the internal signs, doesn't it? This internal fire.
Yes. This is what Spurgeon calls the first sign of the heavenly call. And he describes it as an irresistible, overwhelming craving and raging thirst for telling to others what God has done to our own souls.
It's not just a mild interest, then.
Not at all. It's a compulsion. It's not about
No.
loving theology or liking public speaking. It's an all-consuming drive.
He uses some pretty powerful analogies. He compares it to a mother bird's instinct for her young, something so primal she would die before abandoning it.
He does. And he also brings up the Puritan minister Elaine, who is said to be infinitely and insatiably greedy of the conversion of souls.
Insatiably greedy, that phrase really sticks with you. It's an appetite that can't be filled by anything else.
And that's the point. This desire has to be so strong that it makes you weary of any other pursuit. Which leads us to what you could call the test of contentment.
This is where Spurgeon gets really tough. He basically asks a person, could you be happy doing anything else?
Anything else at all. He lists them off: newspaper editor, or a grocer, or a farmer, or a doctor, or a lawyer, or a senator, or a king. And he says if you could be content in any of those roles, then you are probably not the man called to the pastorate.
I have to admit, that sounds incredibly harsh. Why would being a good doctor or a good farmer disqualify you?
Because the call has to be absolute. If the desire is truly from God, it comes with that sense of, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. The word has to be like a fire in your bones. If you can happily settle into a comfortable, respectable, worldly job.
It proves the fire was never really there to begin with.
Or at least it wasn't the kind of divine conflagration required for this office. A true pastor has to feel that any other path in life would be a kind of spiritual demotion, an unbearable suffocation of what the Spirit is doing in him.
So it's a spiritual necessity, not just one of several good career options.
That's exactly. But, and this is a huge but time, this internal fire, no matter how strong it feels, it has to be tested rigorously.
You can't mistake a whim for inspiration, as he says.
Right? Or a childish preference for a call of the Holy Spirit. This desire needs time. It needs to be processed. It has to be thoughtful and persistent.
Not just a sudden impulse you get after hearing a really moving sermon.
No. It has to be something that grows out of your heart in its best moments when you're closest to God. It has to be a calm, clear-headed resolve that's still there after you've counted the cost, the hardship, the low pay, the criticism, all of it.
And if a great job offer comes along with a big salary and that resolve starts to wobble,
that's a pretty good sign the call was never from God in the first place. Which leads to the next test, the purity of the desire. Is it disinterested?
meaning is the motivation pure?
Purely for the glory of God and the good of souls. Spurgeon is absolute on this. Any mercenary motive, even in the smallest degree, he says, will spoil it all.
And when he says mercenary motives, what all does that include? It's not just about money, is it?
No, it's about any kind of self-gain. Are you seeking the pulpit because it's a respectable position in society? Because it gives you time to study and read? Are you doing it because you crave the affirmation and applause of a crowd?
So even that little desire for recognition or respect, that's enough to poison the whole thing.
It is, because it shows the heart isn't pure. The pulpit can never be a ladder by which ambition is to climb. Disinterestedness means you do the work, even if it meant total obscurity, no comfort, and constant scorn.
John Newton adds another layer to this, a kind of humility check.
He does, and it's so helpful. He says you should ask yourself if this desire to preach is strongest when you are in your most lively and spiritual frames. and crucially, when we are most laid in the dust before the Lord.
In other words, the desire should be most intense when you feel the least worthy of it.
Precisely. If your zeal to preach to other people is stronger than your own hunger for grace in your own soul, Newton says that's a huge warning sign. It suggests the whole thing is coming from a selfish place, not from the Spirit of God. If you love the act of preaching more than you love Christ, you've got a problem.
Okay, so we've covered the internal fire, the desire. Now we have to move on to the actual equipment, the necessary gifting. It's not enough to want it, you have to be able to do it.
Right. You have to have an aptness to teach and some measure of the other qualities needful for the office. This is the practical part. If God calls a man to a job, he gives him the tools for it.
And the most basic tool for a preacher is the ability to communicate. A man has to prove that he can speak.
Yes. This isn't about being some polished, silver-tongued orator right out of the gate.
Yeah.
But the basic gift of utterance has to be there in some measure from the beginning. There has to be evidence that you can actually communicate spiritual truth in a way people can understand.
Spurgeon's analogy here is pretty memorable. He says God didn't create Behemoth to fly.
Right. If you don't have the wings, the basic mental and physical capacity for public speaking, then wanting to be a preacher is, well, it's a bit foolish. The desire has to match the equipment.
So you have to actually test yourself. Give yourself a fair trial speaking to others.
You have to. You have to see if you can actually edify others with discourses. Some people are full of passion, but, as Spurgeon puts it, they can talk forever and ever upon nothing. That's not a gift for preaching.
Which brings us to intellectual and doctrinal clarity. You have to avoid that conspicuous absence of brains.
Yes. The ministry needs clear, consecutive thought. Vehemence and zeal are not enough if a man can't structure an argument or grasp theological concepts. Spurgeon had very little patience for men whose conceit most broad was matched only by a mind that was most narrow.
The hollowness of the drum, as he put it.
That's the one. The mind has to be up to the task of handling Scripture. And that leads directly to the need for definite doctrinal belief. You can't be a novice who hasn't made up their minds upon theology.
This is a huge deal in the Reformed world, isn't it? The idea of a settled, systematic doctrine.
It is. A pastor is called to defend and declare a specific body of truth. So if a man comes along and says his mind is open to anything, or that he's just prepared to receive the doctrines of the college, whatever they may be,
He's fundamentally unfit.
he is. It shows he's unstable, a novice. If you haven't wrestled with and settled on the big things, God's sovereignty, salvation, the authority of Scripture, you have no business trying to lead others. You need to go back to being a student.
But the pastorate is about more than just being a good theologian or teacher. It involves that other half we mentioned, ruling, so you need the full pastoral character.
That's why the lists in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 are so comprehensive. The man has to govern, not just lecture. So beyond being apt to teach, he needs sound judgment and solid experience.
A whole range of character traits, gentle manners, loving affections, but also firmness and courage.
It's that balance. Tenderness and sympathy, yes, but also the strength to lead. The analogy that's often used is that of a father figure for the church.
He needs to be head and shoulders above the rest, in grace, a counselor.
And crucially, he needs gifts administrative in ruling well. This is just as required as the gift of teaching. Can he manage conflict? Can he oversee finances with integrity? Can he guide the church's mission?
So a man could be a brilliant speaker, but if he's a total mess administratively, or he crumbles in the face of conflict, he's not fit for the office.
That's right. He might be a gifted orator, but he won't be a shepherd. He won't be a pastor.
I want to circle back to a really practical point Spurgeon made, one that might sound a little odd to us today, and that's physical suitability.
Yeah, you have to see this through the eyes of the 19th century. There were no microphones. Preaching was physically demanding work. So Spurgeon's general rule was that if God calls a man to cry aloud and spare not, he usually provides him with suitable lungs.
So if a man physically struggled to project his voice, he saw that as a potential sign from God.
He saw it as a serious question. If a man had a contracted chest, or if he could barely get through a sermon without being in pain, it raised doubts about whether God intended him for a lifetime of habitual public preaching. He even lists things like stammering or a defective mouth.
But what about someone like Moses, who said he was slow of speech? Is Spurgeon saying God would never call someone with a physical limitation?
That's the nuance, right? He presents this as a general rule, not an absolute one. Of course, there are exceptions where God is glorified through weakness. But as a general principle, for a man discerning a career of constant public speaking, If the physical equipment is obviously not up to the task, he should at least consider if God has another sphere of service for him. It's a very practical test of readiness for the job.
Okay, so once the internal desire and the necessary gifts have been tested, we move to the external proofs, the public validation.
Yes, Section 4 is all about the external seals. This is the reality check. A private feeling of being called has to be confirmed publicly, tangibly.
And the first seal, and maybe the most intimidating one, is fruitfulness.
Absolutely. After a man starts to use his gifts, he must see a measure of conversion work going on under his efforts. This is the divine stamp of approval. It's God confirming that the commission is real and active.
So it's not enough to just preach the truth faithfully. That truth has to produce visible results.
A minister, Spurgeon says, cannot be sure of his vocation till results are apparent. His commission is without seals until souls are won. His questions on this are just piercing. Prophets whose words are powerless, sowers whose seed all withers, are these God's men.
Wow. So that means a sincere man could preach the gospel for years, but if no one is ever converted, he has to seriously question if he's actually called to be a pastor.
He must. The lack of fruit should cause him unutterable anguish. We already mentioned Jeremiah 23, those who are not sent shall not profit this people at all.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there will be dry seasons, tons of drought, but over the long haul, in the main, the ministry has to show fruit.
The story Spurgeon tells about his own first convert really brings this home.
It's a wonderful story. He talks about the joy he felt over this poor laborer's wife who was converted under his preaching. He called her the first seal to my ministry and said the happiness he felt was like seeing his firstborn son.
That one conversion was all the proof he needed at that moment.
It affirmed his vocation. It proved his work wasn't in vain. Now, beyond that spiritual fruit, the second external seal is the church's prayerful judgment. The local body has to affirm the call.
This isn't a private matter between a man and God. The community is involved.
It has to be. The will of the Lord concerning pastors is made known through the prayerful judgment of his church. The preaching has to be acceptable to the people of God. It has to edify them. If the church isn't being built up by his work, he needs to conclude the pastoral office probably isn't his specific calling.
So the church acts as a kind of jury, a filter for self-deception.
It's the objective counterbalance to a man's own passionate internal feelings. The loving consent of the flock is key. The idea is that the sheep will know the God-sent shepherd. If they don't recognize his voice, he's probably in the wrong fold.
There's a great historical example of this in the source material, the ordination of Robert Hall, Jr.
Yes, and it shows just how seriously this was taken. Hall was only 16 years old, but he had already been exercising his gifts in the church for 4 years.
4 years. They didn't rush him into it just because he was young and zealous. They let the gifts be tested over time.
Exactly. And the final step was this public formal examination by his own father in front of the whole church. They questioned him on his motives, his beliefs, and only after the church was satisfied did they formally set him apart with prayer and the lifting of hands.
It was their public declaration that they, as a body, recognized God's call on his life.
And that external assessment is so vital. Even a man as confident as Spurgeon said he would sooner accept the opinion of a company of the Lord's people than my own on his personal gifts.
That's real humility.
It is. Self-assessment is just not reliable. The collective judgment of wise, spiritual people is the safeguard against personal ambition.
And then John Newton adds one more external seal to this: providential openings.
Right. Newton says the call will be confirmed by a correspondent opening in providence, a gradual series of events that point to the means, the time, and the place to actually begin the work. God will open the doors for those he calls.
So you don't have to kick the door down yourself. You wait for God to open it.
Patience is everything. Newton says you shouldn't be too hasty in catching at first appearances. He even admits that when he was young and impatient, God graciously hedged up my way with thorns to keep him from rushing in before he was ready. Waiting is a test of faith and humility.
All right, let's move into the final section, which is all about the warnings, the test of hardship, and a summary of what disqualifies a man.
Yes. If the call is from God, it comes with the ability to endure hardness. This is not a job for the faint of heart.
It requires soldiers, not fops, earnest laborers, not genteel loiterers.
That's it. The work is full of self-denial. If a man doesn't have a love for the work that goes deeper than his own comfort, he'll start to see it as drudgery and he'll burn out.
He has to be ready for everything: financial struggles, criticism, slander, weariness, being made the offscouring of all things for the sake of Christ.
This is where the call is truly tested. Paul's description of his own ministry in 2 Corinthians 6 is the benchmark. Patience in affliction, distresses, dishonor, evil report. The call is proven by the spiritual grit to keep going when everything and everyone is against you.
The story about Matthew Wilkes testing the missionary candidate is such a perfect illustration of this.
It's fantastic. Wilkes understood that a missionary needed more than just good theology. He needed an iron will, a patient temper, and deep humility. So when this young candidate shows up, Wilkes intentionally makes him wait for hours.
Just leaves him sitting there.
For hours. Then he finally brings him in, and instead of asking him about soteriology, he starts with these almost insulting, trivial questions.
Like, can you spell cat?
Exactly that. And how much is twice 2? And the young man, after this long, frustrating wait, just patiently answers every single one. No anger, no indignation.
And what was Wilkes looking for?
He was testing his character. The long wait tested his patience. The silly questions tested his humility. Wilkes reasoned that if a man can't handle these small annoyances, how on earth is he going to survive the real dangers and insults of the mission field? He passed the test, proving he had the rare qualities needed to endure.
That kind of self-denial is what's needed to screen out the false calls. So let's just quickly summarize those key disqualifiers.
Okay, number 1 is ambition. If a man is driven by a desire to be famous, to be distinguished, if he sees the pulpit as a platform for himself, he's out. That desire for personal glory just poisons the whole enterprise.
The second big one is ministry as a last resort.
The man who's failed at everything else, the businessman who went bankrupt, the lawyer with no clients. He thinks, well, I guess God must be calling me to preach. That idea is just flatly rejected. The ministry demands the best of men, not the leftovers.
If he can't manage worldly affairs, how's he going to manage the affairs of God's house?
The logic is sound. Third is conceit. The man who is full of himself, who thinks he's some kind of unusual genius. A true minister is someone who is constantly humbled by the weight of the work, who feels his own insignificance and nothingness.
Spurgeon had that famous line for an arrogant applicant, didn't he?
He did. He told him he was so dreadfully clever that he couldn't possibly be admitted to the college, where they only had rather ordinary men. Conceit is the opposite of the humility required for service.
And finally, instability.
Yes. Someone who is easily led into strange doctrines, who falls into sin, who is just unstable as water. The ministry demands moral integrity and sound judgment. You can't have a shepherd who is constantly wandering off the path himself.
So as we bring all this together, it's clear that the call to be a pastor is this incredibly multifaceted summons. It's designed to filter out everything but the purest motives.
It really is. It starts with that genuine, all-consuming internal passion, that fire in the bones that's rooted not in self, but in a love for God and for souls.
But that passion isn't enough. It has to be backed up by external gifting. The brains, the ability to teach, clear doctrine, and the character to actually lead and rule well.
And even that's not enough. It then has to be confirmed by the community, by the church's prayerful judgment.
And finally, it has to bear actual fruit. Real spiritual results in people's lives, all orchestrated by God's providence, opening the right doors at the right times. The whole system, really.
It is. And that's why, in the end, the surest test of all is simply experience. If God sustains a man in ministry year after year, blessing his work, and if that man continues to endure the hardships and prove his fitness, well, that confirms the call more powerfully than any initial feeling of zeal ever could.
So whether you're listening and trying to discern a call in your own life, or you're just trying to evaluate the leaders you have, this framework gives you some really solid historical criteria to work with. It forces you to ask the hard question, was this man sent, or did he just appoint himself?
And maybe a final thought for you to carry with you. We mentioned Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 6, where he lists all the tribulations a true minister has to endure. He says they should be prepared to be as dying, and behold, we live as chastened and not killed.
So think about that for a moment, the paradoxical nature of this calling. A calling where suffering and weakness and affliction, they aren't signs that you're failing. They're actually part of the job description for success in God's eyes. What does that tell you about the kind of character this service really demands?
That readiness for affliction is what separates the true soldier from the genteel loiterer.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Reformed thinking.